Part 1. The Hook and the Fog of War. Introduction. The Ghost of the North Sea. The year was 1914. The summer heat was fading into a crisp, uncertain September. For centuries, the British Royal Navy had been the undisputed master of the waves. Their doctrine was built on the wooden walls of old, now replaced by the massive, smoke-belching steel hulls of the dreadnought era. To the British public, the Navy was invincible. To the enemy, it was a wall of iron that could not be breached. But beneath the surface of the North Sea, something was moving. Something small, cramped, and experimental. It didn't carry the hundreds of guns of a battleship, nor did it have the majestic profile of a cruiser. It was a predator that didn't play by the rules of gentlemanly warfare. This is the story of the HMS Pathfinder. It wasn't just a ship lost to the sea, it was the first victim of a new era. It was the moment the world realized that a multi-million-pound warship, carrying hundreds of brave souls, could be erased from existence in a matter of minutes by a single, invisible mechanical fish. This is the story of the day the rules of war changed forever. The pride of the Scout class. To understand the tragedy of the Pathfinder, we have to understand what she was. Launched in 1904, the HMS Pathfinder was the lead ship of her class of scout cruisers. In the early 20th century, naval strategy relied heavily on scouts, ships that were fast enough to find the enemy fleet and light enough to outrun them. The Pathfinder was a beautiful piece of Edwardian engineering. She displaced about 2,900 tons and was powered by triple expansion engines that could push her to a top speed of 25 knots. She was sleek, armed with 9 4-inch guns, and crewed by roughly 260 men. By 1914, however, she was already becoming a bit of a greyhound of yesteryear. The naval arms race was moving so fast that a ship built in 1904 felt like an antique by the time the Great War actually broke out. A world at tipping point. August 1914 had been a whirlwind of mobilizations and declarations. When Britain entered the war, the Royal Navy immediately moved to blockade Germany. The strategy was simple: keep the German high seas fleet in their ports, starve the German industry of resources, and wait for the decisive clash of titans, a massive battleship engagement that everyone expected would happen within weeks. The crew of the Pathfinder, commanded by Captain Francis Martinleake, found themselves assigned to the 8th Destroyer Flotilla. Their job was to patrol the Firth of Forth in Scotland. It was grueling, repetitive work. They were looking for German mine layers or scouts. The idea that a submarine could travel all the way from Germany to the Scottish coast and successfully hunt a moving warship was, to many in the Admiralty, still the stuff of science fiction. Submarines were seen as un-English. The great Admiral Lord Beresford once famously dismissed them as underhand, unfair, and un-English. But the Germans, knowing they couldn't match Britain ship for ship in a surface fight, had invested heavily in the U-boot. The tension in the North Sea. As the Pathfinder steamed through the choppy, cold waters of the North Sea in early September, the atmosphere on board was a mix of boredom and high-alert anxiety. The men were scanning the horizon for smoke, the telltale sign of a German cruiser. They weren't looking down. The British didn't yet have sonar. They didn't have depth charges. They barely even had a protocol for what to do if a periscope was spotted. The Pathfinder was burning coal at a rapid rate, which would become a critical factor in the hours to follow. Because of a coal shortage at the time, Captain Martinleake was under orders to conserve fuel. This meant the Pathfinder was cruising at a modest 5 knots, a speed that made her a sitting duck, though no one knew that term yet. Inside the cramped corridors of the ship, the engineers worked the boilers, the lookouts squinted against the glare of the North Sea sun, and the officers plotted courses around Street Ab's Head. They were guarding the gateway to Scotland, unaware that a steel cylinder of death was already positioned directly in their path. Part 2. The Silent Hunter. The Iron Coffin. While the crew of the HMS Pathfinder was enjoying the crisp air of the North Sea, a few dozen meters below the surface, the atmosphere was drastically different. Inside the SMU-21, the air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of battery acid. This was the world of the German U-boat service. In 1914, these vessels were not the sophisticated hunters of World War II. They were experimental, cramped, and terrifyingly dangerous, not just for the enemy, but for the men who manned them. Every dive was a gamble with physics. At the center of this claustrophobic world was Captain Lieutenant Otto Herzing. Herzing was not a man of noble birth or grand aristocratic standing. He was a professional, a pioneer who understood the technical nuances of this new form of warfare. He knew that his ship, the U-21, was a marvel of engineering. Unlike earlier models that used volatile gasoline engines, the U-21 was powered by reliable manned diesel engines. This gave her the range to travel from the German base at Heligoland all the way to the Scottish coast, a feat many British admirals thought impossible for a toy like a submarine. The Predator in the Deep. 4 days, Herzing and his crew of 28 men had been playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek. Their routine was grueling. During the day, they stayed submerged to avoid detection by British patrols, moving slowly to conserve battery power. At night, they would surface to run the diesel engines, venting the stale air and recharging the massive lead-acid batteries that powered them under the waves. The U-21 was roughly 64 meters long, scarcely longer than a modern swimming pool, yet it carried 4 torpedo tubes and a supply of the G/6 torpedoes. These were the primary weapons, 50-centimeter diameter cylinders packed with nearly 350 pounds of TNT. By September 5, 1914, Herzing had reached the mouth of the Firth of Forth. He was deep in British waters, a place where no German surface ship would dare to linger. He was looking for a fat prize, a battleship or a high-value cruiser. What he found instead was a sleek, 3-funneled scout cruiser, the Pathfinder. The sighting. It was mid-afternoon. The sea was relatively calm, but a light haze hung over the water, which was a gift to a submarine commander. Herzing raised the periscope, a brief, cautious glance that lasted only seconds to avoid leaving a wake that a sharp-eyed lookout might spot. Through the crosshairs he saw her. The Pathfinder was steaming east-southeast. To Herzing's surprise, the British cruiser was moving remarkably slowly. As we mentioned in Part 1, the Pathfinder was trying to save coal, crawling along at about 5 knots. In the world of naval combat, speed is life. At 5 knots, the Pathfinder was barely making steerage way. She was a static target in a dynamic ocean. Herzing couldn't believe his luck. Had the Pathfinder been zigzagging, a tactic that would later become standard procedure, the U-21 would have struggled to get into an attack position. But the British didn't believe they were in danger. They were patrolling, and in their minds, patrolling meant a steady, predictable course. The maneuver. Herzing gave the order, "Auf Serortief," to periscope depth. The crew moved with practiced silence. In a submarine, you don't run, you move deliberately. Noise travels through water, and the British might have hydrophones, crude underwater microphones, though in reality, the Pathfinder wasn't equipped with anything that could hear them. The U-21 began a slow, underwater stalk. Herzing had to calculate the deflection, the lead distance needed to fire the torpedo so that it would intersect with the moving ship. He factored in the Pathfinder's speed, 5 knots, the torpedo's speed, about 35 knots, and the distance, roughly 2,000 yards. Inside the torpedo room, the tin fish was prepped. The air flasks were charged to 2,500 psi. The depth-keeping mechanism was set. The crew waited. The tension was suffocating. If they missed, the Pathfinder would see the bubble trail, turn, and likely ram them or signal for destroyers to hunt them down. This was a one-shot opportunity. Los! At 3:43 p.m., Herzing took one final look. The Pathfinder was perfectly framed in the periscope. She was just off Street Ab's head, the rugged cliffs of the Scottish coast visible in the background. Tube 1. Fire! The submarine shuddered as the compressed air forced the torpedo out of the tube. A muffled roar echoed through the hull. For the men inside the U-21, there was nothing left to do but wait. They counted the seconds, staring at the stopwatches. 20 seconds. 40 seconds. 60 seconds. In the silence of the deep, they waited for the sound that would signal either their triumph or their discovery. They didn't have to wait much longer. Part 3: The Fatal Encounter. A quiet afternoon shattered. On the deck of the HMS Pathfinder, the atmosphere was deceptively peaceful. It was approximately 3:45 p.m. Some of the crew were finishing their afternoon tea, others were preparing for the change of the watch. The ship was lazily cutting through the water at 5 knots, making a gentle wake. Captain Martinleak was on the bridge. Despite the relaxed speed, the lookouts were at their posts. They weren't just looking for ships, they were scanning for the telltale signs of mines. The British naval mind was still obsessed with mines. The idea of a mobile mine, a torpedo, coming from an invisible boat was still a secondary fear. Then, the silence was broken. A lookout on the starboard side screamed a warning that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Torpedo! Port bow! The bubble trail of death. A torpedo in 1914 wasn't the silent, wake-less weapon of the modern age. It was powered by a compressed air engine, which meant it left a vivid, bubbling white line on the surface of the dark North Sea water. From the bridge, the officers saw it, a straight, relentless line of foam heading directly for the ship's midsection. At 5 knots, the Pathfinder had almost no maneuverability. Captain Martinleak immediately ordered, "Hard a port!" and "Full speed ahead!" in a desperate attempt to turn the ship's narrow bow toward the incoming threat or simply outrun it. But it was too late. The Pathfinder was a heavy beast of steel, and she needed time to gather momentum. To the men on deck, those seconds felt like hours. They watched the white line get closer and closer. Some men braced themselves against the railings. Others simply froze, paralyzed by the sight of the inevitable. The point of no return. The torpedo struck the Pathfinder just behind the bridge, near the forward mast. In a lucky strike for the Germans, the torpedo didn't just punch a hole in the hull, it hit the ship's most vulnerable spot, the forward magazine. The magazine was where hundreds of shells and cordite charges were stored. When the 350-pound warhead of the German G/6 torpedo detonated, the initial explosion was already massive. But it was the secondary explosion that sealed the ship's fate. The torpedo's blast triggered the cordite in the magazine. The result wasn't just a hit, it was an annihilation. The Great Explosion. Eyewitnesses on the shore at St. Abb's Head and on nearby fishing boats described a scene out of a nightmare. They didn't just see an explosion, they saw the Pathfinder disappear. There was a flash of blinding orange light, followed by a pillar of smoke that rose hundreds of feet into the air. The force of the magazine exploding was so violent that it literally broke the back of the ship. The entire front section of the Pathfinder, from the bridge forward, was blown to splinters. One witness, a local fisherman, said it looked like a giant volcano had suddenly erupted in the middle of the sea. Debris, jagged pieces of steel, coal dust, furniture, and tragically, human remains, was hurled high into the sky, raining down over a wide radius. The sound of the blast was so loud it was heard miles inland, rattling the windows of Scottish coastal villages. The physics of destruction. Why was the sinking so fast? Most ships take minutes or hours to sink as water gradually fills the compartments. But the Pathfinder was different. Because the magazine exploded, the structural integrity of the hull was instantly destroyed. The ship didn't just take on water, she fell apart. The stern, the back of the ship, was thrown upward by the force of the blast before it began to slide into the depths. The engines were still running, the propellers still turning in the air for a few horrifying seconds as the ship tilted toward the vertical. For the men in the engine room and the boiler rooms, there was no chance. The explosion would have killed many instantly through the shockwave alone. For those on the deck near the stern, they were suddenly standing on a platform that was tilting at a 45-degree angle, slick with oil and coal dust, sliding toward a freezing ocean. 4 minutes. From the moment the torpedo struck to the moment the last piece of the Pathfinder's stern vanished beneath the waves, only 4 minutes had passed. Think about that. A 3,000-ton warship, the pride of her class, with over 260 men on board, was gone in less time than it takes to boil an egg. The North Sea, which had been calm just moments before, was now a churning mess of oil, wreckage, and struggling men. High above, the massive mushroom cloud of smoke, a mix of black coal smoke and white steam from the burst boilers, hung in the air like a tombstone. And below the surface, Otto Herzing and the crew of the U-21 watched through their periscope in stunned silence. They had expected to damage a ship, they hadn't expected to witness its total vaporization. Part 4: Chaos and Catastrophe. The silence after the storm. In the seconds following the disappearance of the HMS Pathfinder, a heavy, unnatural silence fell over the water. The roar of the explosion had ceased, replaced only by the hissing of steam escaping from submerged boilers and the distant, eerie cries of seagulls disturbed by the blast. Where a 370-foot warship had stood moments before, there was now only a massive, bubbling slick of black oil, churning water, and a thick carpet of debris. This wasn't just wood and cork. The sea was littered with the intimate remains of a community: sailors' hats, letters, pieces of a wooden piano from the officers' mess, and thousands of pieces of coal that had been ejected from the ship's bunkers. A sea of oil and coal. For the men who survived the initial blast, the struggle for life had only just begun. The North Sea in September is not warm. It is a chilling 12 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius, 54 degrees Fahrenheit to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. In these temperatures, exhaustion and hypothermia set in within minutes. However, the cold wasn't the only enemy. The explosion had ruptured the ship's fuel bunkers. The survivors found themselves swimming in a thick, viscous layer of heavy fuel oil mixed with pulverized coal dust. It was a toxic sludge that stung the eyes, filled the lungs, and made it nearly impossible to grip onto floating wreckage. The captain's survival. Miraculously, Captain Francis Martinleague survived. He had been on the bridge, the very area near the explosion's epicenter, yet he was blown clear into the water. Despite being wounded and dazed, he maintained the composure expected of a Royal Navy officer. He was found clinging to a piece of wreckage surrounded by his men. The survival stories were harrowing. Some sailors reported being blown through the air and waking up in the water with no memory of how they got there. Others had been below decks and were saved only because the force of the blast literally peeled the ship open, allowing them to float out of the disintegrating hull before it dragged them to the bottom. The rescue mission? The explosion had been so massive that it was seen by the crews of the HMS Stag and HMS Express, destroyers that were patrolling nearby. They immediately turned their engines to full speed, racing toward the pillar of smoke. But the first on the scene were the civilians. Local Scottish fishing trawlers from Eyemouth and Street Abs, seeing the volcano on the horizon, didn't hesitate. They steered their fragile wooden boats directly toward the site of the disaster. What they found was a scene of carnage. One rescuer described the water as being so thick with oil and debris that the boats could hardly move through it. The sailors they pulled from the water were unrecognizable, blackened from head to toe by oil and coal dust, their skin often peeling away due to the horrific steam burns from the burst boilers. The grim tally. As the hours passed, the reality of the loss began to set in. Out of the 268 men on board the Pathfinder that day, the loss of life was near total. Among the dead were 4 civilian canteen assistants and a young wireless operator who had stayed at his post until the very end, trying to broadcast a distress signal that the explosion never allowed him to finish. The horror in the hospital. The few survivors were taken to the local infirmary at Leith. The townspeople were shocked by the sight of them. These weren't the dashing sailors of recruitment posters. They were broken men, many of them blind from the oil or suffering from internal injuries caused by the massive pressure wave of the underwater explosion. The physical wreckage of the ship was also washing up on the Scottish shores. For weeks, the tide brought in grim reminders, pieces of the deck, personal belongings, and bodies. The local community was plunged into mourning, a stark realization that the war, which many thought would be over by Christmas, was going to be much darker and more personal than they ever imagined. Part 5. The Aftermath and Legacy. The Great Cover-Up. In the immediate wake of the disaster, the British Admiralty faced a crisis of public relations. The loss of a scout cruiser was bad enough, but admitting how it was lost was unthinkable. At that time, the official British stance was that submarines were toys, or, at best, coastal defense vessels incapable of offensive operations in the open sea. To admit that a single German U-boat had infiltrated the Firth of Forth and obliterated a British warship would have sparked a national panic. Consequently, the first official reports released to the press claimed that the HMS Pathfinder had struck a mine. However, the truth is a difficult thing to bury in the era of eyewitnesses. The Scottish fishermen who had raced to the scene had seen the torpedo's wake. The survivors, recovering in the Leith infirmary, spoke of the white line of bubbles and the suddenness of the strike. Within days, the narrative shifted. The Admiralty was forced to admit the terrifying truth: the U-boat had arrived, and the Royal Navy was vulnerable. The live bait lessons. The sinking of the Pathfinder was a bloody nose for the British, but tragically, the lessons weren't learned fast enough. Only 2 weeks later, a single German submarine, the U-9, would sink 3 British cruisers, the Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy, in a single afternoon, killing nearly 1,500 men. The Pathfinder was the warning shot across the bow of the British Empire. It proved several things that changed naval warfare forever. 1. Speed is life. Ships could no longer afford to conserve fuel by moving slowly in danger zones. 2. The zigzag. The Admiralty soon mandated that all ships must move in a zigzag pattern to make it harder for U-boat commanders to calculate a torpedo solution. 3. The destroyer screen. Large ships would never again go out without a screen of smaller, faster destroyers to hunt for periscopes. The fate of the hunter and the hunted. Otto, the commander of the U-21, became one of Germany's first aces of the deep. He proved that the submarine was not just a defensive tool but a strategic weapon that could project power hundreds of miles from home. Herzing survived the war, having sunk over 40 ships, including 2 battleships during the Gallipoli campaign. He remains one of the few U-boat commanders from the Great War who died of old age, passing away in 1960. As for the HMS Pathfinder, she remains at the bottom of the North Sea, resting in 2 pieces about 46 meters deep. Because she was a victim of a magazine explosion, the wreck is a chaotic tangle of steel, a grim underwater cemetery for the 257 men who never had a chance to say goodbye. Today, the site is protected under the Protection of Military Remains Act, a designated war grave that serves as a silent reminder of that Saturday afternoon in September. Conclusion: the end of innocence. The sinking of the Pathfinder on September 5, 1914, was more than just a naval loss. It was the end of the Victorian era of warfare. For centuries, the Royal Navy had operated on the principle of visibility, showing the flag, intimidating the enemy with massive hulls and heavy guns. The Pathfinder was destroyed by a weapon that didn't show its face, a weapon that struck from the dark. It was the moment that, gentlemanly, war died and the era of industrial, technological, and invisible slaughter began. When you look at the rugged cliffs of St. Abb's Head today, the water looks calm and blue. But beneath those waves lies the wreckage of a ship that taught the world a terrifying lesson. In the age of the machine, even the mightiest wall of steel can be brought down by a single, well-aimed strike from the deep. The Pathfinder didn't just find the enemy that day, she found the future of warfare. And that future was cold, silent, and deadly.